legalizefreedom.com.
Good evening. I'm Greg Moffat of legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com. And this evening I just want to speak briefly about 4 things to look out for emerging from the current coronavirus crisis here in 2020. Currently find ourselves in the second half of July. Now, the 4 things that I'm going to mention are all interconnected, and they overlap and indeed connect into many other things. So they're way more than 4, but these are 4 bullet points, I guess, that when I was trying to summarize when I wrote about the possibilities for the pandemic early on in the year. This was in a magazine called New Dawn. The article's called Living in the Corona Apocalypse. This is the current special issue of New Dawn, not the current regular issue, but in any event, you can find that in print and digital at newdawnmagazine.com. Now, in the order I presented them in the article and in the order they're in at the start of this video, they were as follows. A social credit system, basically rewards for good behaviour, mandatory vaccines, a sort of passport for international travel, digital currency, i.e. no more cash, and universal basic income, which is basically a state handout whether you've got a job or not. And for many people what that would amount to was, especially in the current economy, a form of a permanent dole. Now, I will say that the idea of a social credit system, being rewarded and allowed to do things in return for complying with governmental diktats and just generally being whatever they decide a good citizen is, as you have in China, that could be said to encapsulate all the other things. So really what you might end up with is a lot of these social engineering measures culminating or being building blocks of a social credit system. But it'll look different in different countries, and some countries, i.e. China, are further along the road than others. But I'm just mentioning these particular ones because they're recurring themes. They're not new ideas by any means. They've already existed for a long time in various forms, but they are currently, the push for them is accelerating exponentially throughout this crisis. So I think it's worth going back over them. They may be new to some of you, and others will be very familiar with them. If we move past the headline social credit thing, we'll come back to that and just talk about the vaccination thing, because that's a hot topic at the minute. Now, I don't want to get into about, the vaccination, pro-vaccinations, anti-vax stuff. I don't really have a dog in that fight. It seems clear enough to me that some vaccines come with problems and some are relatively problem-free. That's not really the issue. The issue here is if there was a mandated vaccine for COVID-19 or anything similar, is basically what that would mean in terms of our freedom. Now, I should just say at this point that, again, I'm no expert, but I did a little bit of research, and it appears that the fastest ever vaccine developed, possibly for a virus, I'm not sure, but was over 4 years. The average time for a successful and safe vaccine, relatively safe vaccine, to go to market is over 10 years. And there has, as I understand it, never been a vaccine developed for any coronavirus ever. Now, if any of that is inaccurate, I'm sure you can let me know in the comments below, but that's my current understanding. So taking that as a background, it would seem that the prospects for a safe and effective vaccine for COVID-19 being developed anytime soon are probably fairly remote. Point is, the idea would be that not so much that people would be dragged from their homes or forced to take the vaccine in any way at all. It would all be quote unquote voluntary. Not necessarily everywhere and all the time, but initially that's how it would be pitched, because the idea of forced vaccinations is always going to be very fraught. There are going to be people who will die rather than take a vaccination against their will, and fair enough. So governments don't really want to go down that route. I mean, they have a civil war on their hands. But what they can do, similar to some of these other measures, is make your life extremely difficult if you don't go along with it. So let's just say, for example, for the sake of argument, one is developed for religious reasons, for health reasons, or just for personal sovereignty reasons. You're not interested in having this, and you're healthy, you haven't had a problem, so why bother? Well, as I mentioned in the bullet points, the first thing that could happen is that you then cannot travel outside of your own country. Now that would be relatively easy to do. It would just become part of your passport, in the way that there's certain places in the world you can't travel without certain shots and what have you, and there are certain places you can't go on certain types of passport. Not everywhere in the world will accept passports from certain Middle Eastern countries. There are some places in the world, if you fly or travel on an American passport, you might become a kidnap risk. So your passport comes with all sorts of potential for control. So the idea here would be that you don't have to have a vaccination at all, but the countries you can travel to would be very limited. Now, I don't know whether countries will be able to choose themselves whether to accept visitors who haven't had the vaccine. It might be commercially worthwhile. That's really another argument, but that would be the first step. And I'm led to believe that something like 60 or 70% of Americans don't have passports, therefore they're possibly not very interested in traveling abroad. But you could see how this could become creeping in by stealth. There will be other things that you couldn't do. For example, maybe work in certain places. Now, this wouldn't be viable for a mom and pop store to say that their employees have to be vaccinated, but maybe some of the top corporations would be like that. Maybe some of the top tourist destinations in Disneyland or whatever. Though from what I hear about the reopening of Disneyland, it doesn't sound like much fun at all, a place to be if it ever was. So I think the international travel would probably be the easiest one to implement. And given that the virus spread across the world very quickly, that's the picture that the media has presented, then it would be very, very easy to link that with travel and just say you cannot go. People from China travel to Italy and all over the place, and it spread like wildfire. You cannot go far from home without that. Don't have to have it. It's entirely up to you. Now, of course, there could be years of litigation and disputes and challenges to that. But again, it's something to look out for, because people are already talking about this as ways to, limit the spread. So that's that. It's a big issue. There's a lot to it, but that's just one little aspect of it. This has a lot in common with the push for cashless society, digital currency. And the push for that has come in the current crisis because cash, of course, itself is now seen as a transmitter of infection. Objects that are passed from one person to another directly without being cleaned. Well, cash is filthy anyway, we know that, but that's anybody who handles a lot of it knows to take care. And a lot of you have probably found already that simple things like when stores and cafes and things have begun to reopen, that simple act of buying a coffee has now become a matter of not only card-only payment, but preferably contactless in every sense of the word. So you're not even touching a keypad, which again could potentially spread infection. And the ramifications for doing away with cash are well known. The whole cashless society control grid, which, for example, David Icke has been talking about for decades. That's manifestly a very efficient way to control people, because if your cash is digital, You know, even if it's in the bank, as we know, it can be switched on and off accidentally or at will. We've probably all at some point in life had a card rejected and we're like, well, there's money in the account. What's the problem? So the potential for control there is enormous. And if you tie that in with the third dimension of this, the universal basic income, then you can see how it would all come together. Universal basic income is kind of what it sounds like. It's a sort of form of dole, but the idea is it would be for the sake of argument, a monthly payment made by governments to all citizens, regardless of their wealth or income. In order to make it completely fair, billionaires get it, people who are penniless get it. And let's say it was $1,000 a month, and the idea is that it's a basic level of subsistence income, enough to get by. On that sort of money, if you're lucky, you will exist. And then above that, it's all a bonus. So people say it would discourage work. It would, certainly there are some people clearly who are happy already to exist on government dole for decades and not interested in making any effort to move themselves out of that. But really, the idea is that it's so basic that you do have an incentive to work a little bit anyway. And it also overlaps with some of the trends that we were told to expect, you know, back in the 70s and 80s in particular, in the early 21st century. Automation, mechanization, computerization was going to make so much human labor obsolete. We were going to spend our days in the park drinking wine and reading poetry, but we would need to earn money somehow. So that the trade-off was going to be something like universal basic income. And that is now being talked about as well, not so much in the light of the automation and whatnot I just mentioned a moment ago, but now under the spectre of mass unemployment and layoffs. The number of companies that have been wiped out, the job losses running into tens, hundreds of millions if you look worldwide. So the proponents of universal basic income, or basic income as it's sometimes called, also called citizens' income, they're now coming to the fore again, claiming it now is the time to implement this. And of course, automation isn't going away. So they say this is like a perfect storm, and the time for the idea has arrived. So if we put all that together, the vaccination idea, passport for international travel, digital currency, no more cash, and UBI, what you have there is the potential for a matrix for almost complete control of your money and your mobility. And those are the two things that really in a technocratic society, a technical society, that mark out your freedom, you know, your ability to be able to control those two things. Where can you go? What can you do? Now, most controls on individuals, as we've seen it in the past in times of war or in dictatorships, can be circumvented with money. That can get you a long way, but most people won't really have enough money to buy their way wherever they want to go and do whatever they want to do. So money and mobility. And this further overlaps with what I was talking about in a previous video, which is the idea that if this virus crisis has not been introduced in order to achieve the ends that I'm about to mention, then it makes sense for those who are wanting to see certain major changes in the world to seize the moment. And that is to say, a massive reduction in human activity and consumption and movement in the name of saving the earth. Whether that's from the point of view of pollution and environmental degradation, or whether it's because with the fossil fuel situation, we can no longer have the cheap energy to run the industrial societies that we've all been enjoying, or many of us have been, and many more aspire to. Either of those, a bit of both, But for many people, now is the time to push these agendas forward. So that's simply it. So a few things to look out for going forward. So wherever you happen to be in the world, keep an eye on what your government are saying, what they're doing. And I'd be very interested to hear from various corners of the globe what's actually going on the ground. Are any of these things actually happening? To what extent they're happening? What are you hearing? And we shall see what the next few months bring. All of these projects, good or bad, however you view them, have been, as I say, brewing. They started out as ideas and have been brewing for a long time. And I just feel now that we may see, for better or worse, some serious movement in these areas, say in the months and years to come. So on that note, and for now, I'm Greg Moffat of legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com